Hi. Well, I'm very excited not just to enter into a new chapter here, 2 Samuel 15, but into a whole saga, the rebellion of Absalom, which, as you can see on the right side of the screen, I'm limiting for this purpose to 4 chapters, 15 to 18. Some scholars, as we'll see, expanded all the way to 20, but I stop it at 18 because that's where the death of Absalom is, and certainly Absalom's rebellion ends there, although it is 2 more chapters before David is fully back in charge in Jerusalem. But we'll look at those separately as an aftermath. So what I want to do in this introductory video is just highlight some of the ways this story is a little different than the surrounding text as this narrative of rebellion within the family. It's the longest story in all the books of Samuel and really in all the Deuteronomistic history. 4 chapters about a single incident, really, and it does it in a very dramatic way. So let's begin by looking at what we see on the right side of the screen, some elements of the style. At first, we'll look at 2 elements that emphasize urgency, and they're almost always covered up by the New RSV, which is the translation on the left side of the screen that I use as my default. You may use another one like NIV or NIB or whatever one you choose, but they often leave out the common Hebrew word hina for behold, or leave it as something like look, and I'll be pointing it out each time as I go. You'll note that 17 of 46 times in Samuel are in these 4 chapters, so about a third of it is in about a sixth of the book. And similarly, the technical sounding but easy to understand infinitive absolute, which is to say using a Hebrew verb in its infinitive form and then using it in a different form, doubling it, which really emphasizes the verb. Sometimes translators render that with very or great or some adjective like that. I follow Everett Fox's version that he did early on in his book, A Hebrew Bible, by putting the verb yes verb. So I'll highlight it that way so you can see it clearly in my keyword charts that we'll be looking at for each of these chapters. And similarly, about a third of those uses are in a sixth of the book here. So behold and infinitive absolutes, really highlighting the urgency of the situation. There are also numerous characters and places, and not only are there numerous ones, which you can see here, but the fact that they're so numerous is telling us a lot about the situation of monarchy at the time. So the green ones are Absalom, of course, and his partners, and the purple ones are David's. And it may look like there's more of David's, but that's because many of David's are individuals, and we can see on Absalom's side is all Israel. So a bunch of these are individual people, but all Israel certainly adds up to something. And what we're seeing is, on one hand, is all Israel. On the other hand, are a motley group of foreigners and various people from various places, and they're never called Judah, and Judah as a place is never named here in any of the places that you can see down below. So covering the wide range of territory, which this map, of course, puts the label Judah on here and Israel up here. Here's Jerusalem. But the story will recognize all the way to Beersheba down here, and it'll take place all the way up in Rogelim up here, and David will escape across the Jordan over here to Mahanaim, famous in the book of Genesis by the Jabbok River, where Jacob had his great experience before he reunited with his brother Esau. And so it's going to cover a range of this territory here. But it'll rarely be in Jerusalem. A little bit of it will be, but it'll cover a wide range of territory. And what we don't hear named about Israel is any tribal confederation. We'll hear that when Absalom starts his campaign, he will refer to people as coming from cities, and they'll respond that they're from tribes. But we don't hear tribes named, and we don't hear any sense of Israel organized around tribes. But it's certainly Israel against David's very mixed collection of people here, some of whom are plainly mercenaries, the Cherethites and Pelethites, and some of whom we don't know how they ended up with David, Hushai the Archite or Ittai the Gittite. These people have been with him, but we don't know about it before that. But we don't hear about Nathan. Nathan, who's key to one of the major interpretations of this scene, as we'll see in just a minute, is not mentioned here at all. We haven't seen him since chapter 12 when he gave his little rich man, poor man, ewe lamb, and traveler little story to get David to confess that he was the man who had killed Uriah. And we'll see him again when he goes to Bathsheba and said, if you want to live, you better make sure that the king knows that he said he'd put your son Solomon on the throne. And so Nathan comes in like bookmark places to the whole David and Jerusalem situation, starting in 2 Samuel 7, where he proclaims, of course, that there'll always be one of your descendants on the throne. And so, but he's not in this scene at all. And we have to wonder why he's not there. And many of these other people, Barzillai the Gilead and Machir son of Amiel from Lo Debar, and all these different people we've never heard of otherwise. But of course, faithful Joab is there throughout. So as we're continuing to look at some of the style elements, another is deception in intent and action among the characters. And I put in parentheses among the narrator, because one of the questions that we can never really answer, and scholars have written many books and countless articles trying to argue about it, as far as I can tell with no clear consensus, is, are there multiple narrative voices as well? In other words, is there a pro-David voice and an anti-David voice? Is there a pro-monarchy voice and an anti-monarchy voice? Is there a pro-monarchy in Jerusalem voice but anti-monarchy anywhere in Israel voice? And we certainly hear some of those throughout the books of Samuel and the books of Kings. How much they're present here is something scholars argue about. So is the narrator's purpose to give us one particular interpretation of this or not? Or is the narrator part of the deception? We'll have to decide that as we go. There's also a lot of action. And in many parts of the Bible, there's not a lot of action. In the New Testament, Jesus often speaks for quite a while, and there are other scenes where there's just encounters of speaking. But there's action, not just in the sense of the armies on the move, but the great geographic spread of them all across, and scenes of duplicity and planning. So there's all kinds of action. This is Game of Thrones here, folks, in the most literal sense. There's also, as in Game of Thrones or any good cable drama, whether it's Breaking Bad or whatever your favorite might be, there's humor. And it's often ironic humor as people in positions of power find that their power leads them to the opposite. So in this case, hair-proud Absalom, who has his hair weighed every year, gets his head caught in a tree, and that's where he will be killed. And there's much humor like that because the Bible is very funny. Whether you've been taught that or not, because maybe you've taught it's very serious about various serious things. Well, it certainly is serious. This is life and death. But like Shakespeare or other contemporary drama in our day, even things that are life and death have humor in them, and they need to, otherwise it's all too heavy. So there'll certainly be humor here. And throughout this, as well as throughout so much of Hebrew Bible literature, as Meyer Sternberg has so clearly pointed out, are gaps. Spaces where we'd like to know what's going on, but the text won't tell us. So, for example, you look on the left side of the screen, the transition from the king kissed Absalom to after this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses. What happened in between that? That's not just the next moment. What led Absalom to decide that he would rebel against his father? Where is David in all this? What kind of tone was the kiss? Did they hug as well? All those gaps we cannot answer. And if you've been following my videos, I often raise those kinds of questions to point out the gaps. But here they'll lead to a lot of questions of motivation, especially around David, who's very quiet about his intentions throughout. Which leads us in this middle section here to note three overarching interpretive options. The one that most scholars tend to take by default, because it's the one that the text puts in there by default, is that Nathan's word in 2 Samuel 12:11 is determinative. And let's listen to it as I put it out here on the page. Thus says Yahweh, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this very sun. I took that directly from the RSV, not changing the Hebrew, not changing the English to reflect the fact that Hebrew doesn't have a word for wives, so it should say women. And of course, that would mean, by having it be women, it would include Tamar, who certainly wasn't one of David's wives. This is the interpretation that leads many to think all of this is happening to punish David, including the death of Amnon. But does that make theological sense? We'll find out that 20,000 Israelites die in the battle to save David's reign, which ultimately is saved. Those Israelites die as a part of Yahweh's will. They're certainly not being punished. They didn't do anything bad here. And why is Absalom killed? Is it Yahweh's will to kill Absalom? He's promising to provide justice for Israel, and he's killed by mercenaries and the hired gun of Joab. Is that Yahweh's will? So there are many problems with that interpretation, as we'll see, but that's the one that often transfixes people and they stop thinking about other possible ones. But there are two others, at least. One is that, putting aside the theological element, that David has gone slack in attending to the role of the king to provide security and justice, thus opening a path for Absalom's popular rebellion. For example, we saw in chapter 11 that when the Bathsheba scene started, the narrator started us in the spring of the year when kings go to battle. David's on the roof of his house looking out across at his general's wife, Bathsheba. So not being in battle perhaps is something perceived by ordinary people who can see him on the roof. They'll certainly see Absalom on that very same Ruth going into his father's concubines before the sight of all Israel. So people would certainly see him on the roof, and they'd certainly see he's not in battle. And the fact that Absalom can go out in the street and say, as you can see in verse 4 on the left, if I were a judge in the land, those who had a suit or cause would come to me and I would give them justice, is suggesting they're not getting justice. So perhaps you can read this simply from a secular perspective. David has lost the script here, and Absalom has found it and is trying to provide justice. Not just in the sense that there's an opportunity for an ambitious young man like Absalom, but that the people are not being served by their king, and perhaps Absalom is offering to serve them better. But there's another possibility, and I've been hinting at this and sometimes expressing it in chapters 13 and 14 here, as we note how often David seems to not know what's going on. And as we start our scene here, 9 years will have gone by from the rape of Tamar to when Absalom's rebellion really gets going, not at the beginning of 15, but soon after. And David does nothing throughout that whole time. Nothing about the rape of his, maybe his daughter, nothing about the death of Amnon, nothing about Absalom being out in the street or all these years being alienated. Is it realistic for us to believe that David, who's been on top of things so much and evaded Saul and even lied to the Philistines to get out from under their suspicion that he was not really on their side, that he's suddenly gone completely incompetent? And yet by the end of this, he's competent again. He's still wily, although throughout these chapters we'll see it's not David's thoughts, but the thoughts of those around him that lead him forward. So one of the possibilities is that David is performing. That this whole thing is, as I put there, a long con to clear the obstacles for what Nathan will tell Bathsheba, and the text doesn't contradict, and David ultimately agrees, was David's will that Solomon be the successor, which involved getting Amnon and Absalom out of the way. It'll be no big deal to get Adonijah out of the way in the beginning of 1 Kings. And I'm suggesting that interpretation is to say this is all to please the Egyptian colonial overlords, because Jerusalem under David is a small, meaningless outpost to the grand glory of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. It has no big resources, it's not on a major river, it doesn't have farmland. It was there as a protective safe spot for a David who didn't feel very secure. But now, at this point in the story, it's become his headquarters. But it's nothing compared to Egypt to the south. And as we'll see, the moment Solomon is king, as you can see in 1 Kings 3:1 in my note below, the first thing he does is make a marriage alliance with Pharaoh and bring Pharaoh's daughter into his house in Jerusalem. That could not happen unless the Egyptians wanted their person in Jerusalem. And we'll see at the very other end of 2 Kings, Josiah, who tries to reunite Israel with Judah in Jerusalem, is killed by Pharaoh Necho, not in battle, but like an assassination, almost certainly for not pleasing the Egyptian overlords 3 centuries later. So it may well be that David is playing dumb for years to allow Absalom's rebellion to succeed. All those possibilities and more exist for interpretation within a text full of gaps and ambiguities and wordplays, as we'll see. And then we can look at the shape 2 ways. If we just look at the shape of 15 to 19 here, we see this in terms of color coding of who's the focus. So red for Absalom, purple for David, and the fuchsia for the combined of them. So it starts with just Absalom. Then when it's gaining strength, David exits Jerusalem and ascends the Mount of Olives. When they get to the top and they come down the Mount of Olives, it's a very stylized scene there of the ascent and descent. Then we see this fascinating scene with Absalom consulting with his advisors, including Hushai, who's a double agent working for David there. Then we see the two sides prepare for battle in the Transjordan, so it doesn't take place in the land of promise. The battle ensues and Israel is defeated, and that's what we hear. It's not the forces of Absalom that are defeated as such, but Israel is defeated, and Absalom is killed and buried. And then runners compete, such as it is, to bring good tidings to King David, who, as at least in the performance, has mixed feelings about that. We can also look at the structure of this in a different way, as Falkman puts it here, trying to include all 6 chapters. And it's not a real tight chiasm. You can see A and A prime are not exactly the same topic, although it's about the beginning of the revolt and the end of it. There are certainly some parts that do match more tightly, like the meeting with Ziba and Mephibosheth there. That's certainly a direct match. And there are meetings with advisors and things. But it's certainly a way, as Falkman does from his structuralist perspective, to see see all 6 of these chapters fitting into this action. And it makes sense that it's the rising action up until the death of Absalom and the declining action until the monarchy is again secure in the hands of David. And because this ends with the monarchy secure in the hands of David, we might ask further about Nathan's prophecy. Has David really suffered other than the death of rivals? That Absalom is plainly his rival, and he may cry out in the end, Absalom, my son, Absalom, and that may even be sincere. But as Joab has told him, your men have risked their lives to restore the kingdom to you, so you better get back to work and stop crying over the mission accomplished. And so we'll have to see how family and politics interact here in this story as they do in our time today. So we'll begin next time in the beginning of chapter 15 as Absalom gets to work both as a rebel and as a politician. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.